So if for some crazy reason you're just joining us at our closing keynote and you don't know who I am, my name is Sarah Faulkner. I'm the program manager for Device Talk, so it's my job to put together these agendas and meet all the speakers and help connect everybody. So if that's something you'd like to be interested in, that process, please connect with me. I would love to meet you and learn a little bit more about your story. So I'm really excited for our closing keynote. This is probably a pretty familiar face for the Minnesota MedTech community, but Dave, I want to just begin maybe, could you tell us a little bit about what you do at Boston Scientific, maybe for those that might not be familiar?
Sure. And before I jump into what I do at BAC, I just want to thank everybody for being here, right to the end. This has been a fantastic conversation, and so I really feel honored that you're here right to the end. So want to talk a bit about Boston Scientific. So we are a global medical device company. We have 6 divisions that are each one of them a very weighty business unto themselves. But we also have global functions that really cut across horizontally across those verticals. And so my role as the vice president of corporate research is sort of being part of the organization that gets to kind of cut across. And from a technology point of view, what does that mean? We have obviously functions that are very important in terms of documentation, shared labs, et cetera. Even functional attributes, things like packaging, et cetera, that we do on a global basis, and that actually resides within our global R&D, and that's another VP of R&D who's here as well. Randy Schistel leads that up for the organization on our global technology. And then corporate research is really think about technology platforms that cut across the company, things that are new and different that could really benefit several divisions of the company and patients across a wide swath of medicine that Boston Scientific services. And we also are thinking about areas that are somewhat, there are obviously adjacencies for the divisions. I'm sure we'll get to talk about that, but also areas that are not quite in the purview of the divisions. Either it's not in their core, it's not quite an adjacency, it's too far out in time or space. That's something that we have the privilege of being able to look at from the standpoint of being at the tip of the spear. So if something either doesn't quite fit or addresses multiple divisions, we're doing that in our group.
Yeah, you have such an interesting role because you're working, as you said, across multiple therapeutic areas. So you have this really high-level view of like what's going on with patients all around the world. Can you talk a little bit about kind of current trends that you think are affecting patients and how that plays into your design and development thinking?
Sure. So, I think everyone is familiar with the trends, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But just one stat that, I personally am thinking about, I guess at my ripe old age, is that in 10 years, 20% of us are going to be at retirement age. And at some point along the line here, and getting to be right around the same time, the number of people over the age of 65 begins to be much greater than the number of younger people that are here. So the burden in healthcare just goes way up, and the costs go way up, right? So we have to find ways, not only because of the cost, but because frankly, patients are demanding, better solutions and solutions that are more personalized and proctored for them. So in order to do that, I think we need to be more proactive and we need to be more preventative in the way we're thinking about disease. If I think about the history of Boston Scientific, we have been very much playing in a space of acute treatment. Something needs attention, and we have a plethora of devices that can address that. Increasingly, we're going to be needing to think about the broad continuum of care, and then how do we essentially diagnose and understand that there is disease sooner, maybe even before the patient is seeing any clinical symptoms. And then once we do intervene, how do we maintain that health and keep them healthy and stay, hopefully out of the hospital? So, the other trend I think that I want to talk about is just that, disease and treatment for disease is not evenly distributed in the world. There's definitely an underserved community, and I think it's the job of companies like Boston Scientific to address those. So we do have programs in place, like a program we have called Close the Gap that really addresses cardiovascular disease and sometimes those populations can be in minorities or with women. So we're targeting groups that really preferentially are going after again preventative as well as early diagnosis for cardiovascular disease so that they can seek intervention.
It's interesting to hear you talk a little bit about that transition from acute care to really managing a patient as a whole person, because I think a lot of really big med tech mainstays, Boston Scientific included, are thinking about how to make that transition. We see some young players who are joining the med tech world that are really doing some innovative things there. How, at Boston Scientific, how are you thinking about making that transition? How do you go about doing that? Because that's a transition that's going to involve all of the payers to get on board. That's a transition that involves getting the hospitals and providers on board. So what's it going to take to make that leap?
Right. I mean, the reality is, so I'll just start with addressing that last point, which is that the reality is that everything we do involves all of those stakeholders. So it is absolutely the case that, going forward, we're going to need to engage them in this story. But the good news is that we've been doing this for a long time. Like we actually, many of you know, so I guess it's now 13 years ago, we acquired Guidant and we became it wasn't just that we got into the area of rhythm management, et cetera, but it was actually going from a company that essentially had mechanical chemical devices to one that had active implantables, for the most part. And we had a little bit of that, but this is really a leap into that. And when we did that then automatically meant, because those active implantables have sensors in them, we were now in the world where we have data over time that's being collected on the patients that are using those devices. And what we realized was, and this was a project that we did over 10 years, so it was not a short-term project by any means, but what we realized was that this was an opportunity for us to really dig deep, analyze the data, and understand how we might be able to address the disease of these patients better. And so what that really landed with was developing an algorithm using multiple sensors that are embedded within our defibrillators, implantable defibrillators, that basically calculate a score essentially for a patient and how is their heart failure doing based on how these sensors are picking up the data, and that gets sent to a physician, and based on their preference, they get an alert when things change beyond a certain threshold. Oftentimes, that happens before a patient is feeling sick. So that's really important, because if they're waiting till they're feeling it clinically or they're feeling sick and they go to urgent care, they go to an emergency room or a heart failure clinic, by then it may be too late to change something before they get rehospitalized and have to take care of it. So this is an opportunity for a physician to intervene earlier and make a difference. And so that is the kind of thing that is going to really add value, in the future for devices. So if you think about what that does in, telegraph in the future, where appropriate, devices are increasingly going to have those capabilities, right, to be able to sense, to be able to collect data, and who does that better than the companies that are creating implants that are right there where the action is.
So I hear you talking a lot about data. Can you talk a little bit about you've just described some of the opportunities for digital health and where med tech can play a role there. What are some of the challenges that you foresee in the digital health space as med tech steps into it?
Yeah, so I think, well, I mean, for us, the journey has really been about strategy. Like, we really wanted to start out and understand what does digital health, because I mean, digital health, what does it mean? And then what does it mean for Boston Scientific? And then obviously, many billions of dollars invested in this and in many formats. But we had to really understand how it was going to be important for our patients so we, uh, basically put together, and this was a good example of how we use corporate research actually. We actually started within my team thinking about digital health and putting together sort of a pilot incubator within the company. And this was done in conjunction with our IT organization as well, who had some of the skill sets that we needed to do this, and really kind of in a nascent way developing those DevOps capabilities, which are very agile in nature, et cetera. And then just attacking those and understanding what the use cases were. So for us, it was really about starting small like that. But then once we had that in place, we've actually built an entire organization around digital health. And the main goal for that organization is to enhance really the effectiveness and the safety of the products that we have, and to really better address our patients. And we hired a chief digital health officer within the company. We now have internal DevOps organizations in multiple sites in the company. And the kinds of things that we're addressing with that are, number one, patient engagement, particularly in cases where we really feel like where there is data that could be potentially be available to patients. So we're looking at ways to do that in meaningful ways for patients. And then, of course, I mentioned the holy grail of all this is to really build algorithms and to build value within our products that are based on that, and that essentially result in more effective products for patients that really enhance their lives. So that's really the way that we as a strategic have used it. But I think more broadly in the ecosystem, the way I look at it is that every one of us, and some of the previous talks, really got at this here, is just more and more of healthcare is being administered by non-healthcare professionals, right? Either whether it be by patients or whether it be by home healthcare givers or family members, et cetera. It's actually, most, frankly, of healthcare is happening in that venue. So really giving and continuity of care for those people is really difficult. Like, how do you get the data, really in one spot? Well, I think digital health tools is really one of the only ways to do that. And for people who don't necessarily have all the training, isn't a nurse, I think this becomes an incredibly important and enabling tool for them as well.
Yeah, so let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about specifically some unique innovation opportunities that exist here in Minnesota. If you're not a part of the medtech world, you maybe are a little confused as to why, we host a Device Talks in Minnesota. You're not aware that Minnesota is such a global medtech hub. So talk a little bit about the unique opportunities that exist here for innovation in our industry.
Well, anybody living here knows it. I mean, this is ground zero for medtech. And I would say that it's every aspect, of medical devices this is just, an oasis of talent. It's an oasis of ideas, creativity. Whether you're talking about the strategic companies, which are all essentially based here, one way or another, even at the headquarters, isn't here, or whether you're talking about startups, where there's just many, innovative startups across the spectrum, this is, it is a place to be. And then, of course, Medical Alley brings that all together in a way which facilitates the networking and the conversation, and conversations like we have here with Device Talks, are a huge part of that as well. But that being said, I think, and one of the things I didn't mention, of course, the world-class providers that we have here in Minnesota, which is all part of the ecosystem. What we realized about, I'd say about 10 years ago was that the level of interaction that was there was, not as systemic as we wanted it to be. So we started collaborating in particular with the Mayo Clinic here. And, for us in the Twin Cities, that's it's an hour and a half drive down to Rochester. And it's the most worth it hour and a half I can ever imagine in terms of the kinds of collaboration that we eventually have found with the Mayo Clinic and doing work there. Ultimately, what that has led to, and this was just announced after, again, about 10 years of collaboration on new product development, et cetera, solving problems that are very acute in the physicians' minds at the Mayo, was an accelerator that we put in place, Motion Medical, which really is intended to essentially take the best of what's out there in terms of technology in the Twin Cities and in Rochester, as well as the again the real understanding of clinical needs and the innovation that happens at Mayo, bring that together into companies, projects, and then companies that we can then accelerate using the Twin Cities ecosystem. So that's been one big success, and we're really excited that that's moving forward. The second one is, we also saw here an opportunity to bring University of Minnesota, Mayo Clinic, Medical Alley, and Boston Scientific together in an accelerator right here in the Twin Cities, and we've hosted several cohorts in this, and this is with the Generator Accelerator and the G Beta MedTech Accelerator. And so that has been also just eye-opening for me in terms of, bringing entrepreneurs to the fore, really encouraging them, to step up. And a lot in that particular case, those are companies that are already formed, and it's just about accelerating them. It's 7 weeks of being able to have all the resources of all of those organizations I just mentioned. And believe me, they take advantage of it. And the stories, they come out with at the end of essentially 2 months are that, it's completely worth the 2 months that they invested, which, as you just heard, is a huge amount of time and resources for a startup. So, and then they get visibility through it as well. So those are just a couple of examples how we've tried to influence.
Yeah, from your perspective, from your seat at Boston Scientific, what does it take to keep an ecosystem healthy for the medtech industry? What factors help to keep the Minnesota ecosystem flourishing, and what needs to be added?
Yeah, so we just talked a lot about process here and the process of product development, and it's incredibly important. In my seat, especially when you're talking about the front end of innovation, it's all about the people and the talent. So, any way that you can encourage, anybody who is, who was represented in that, I think it was Dilbert video at the front, who's an engineer and who is a creator and a maker, and, to move down this path is, it's all of our jobs to encourage that here. So it has to do with the education, here, and of course STEM is a huge area of focus for us, both in the corporation as well as in the foundation where I'm on the board, Boston Scientific Foundation, where, in Minnesota, which is one of the areas we really focus on. But so education is a huge part of it. I think another part of it is just support from, local support from the government. Like, for example, anything that we can do to make it easier to innovate here, like the angel tax credit, things like that. That's incredibly helpful, for an ecosystem. Finally, I think just the virtual, being very, just the fact that we have so many strategics in town here, I think is a great resource for entrepreneurs and for startups, and I don't know that it's taken advantage of as much as it really should be. I think most people, who are working in roles like mine, really want to be, back and forth with the startup community as much as possible in order to, obviously, it's we probably get more than we give, but we are able to give some, help along the way as well in terms of, just helping people understand what might be what might be valuable to a company like Boston Scientific.
So, we've heard a lot over these last 2 days about the importance of defining a clinical need, especially if you're early on in the device development process, you're just starting out. Do you have any tips for people who are at that stage of the process? How do you go about defining that unmet need? It's kind of the special sauce of medical device development, and I would love to kind of get at the heart of that.
Yeah, I mean, we spend most of our time when we're talking about early stage product development, exploratory work, et cetera. We spend most of our time in that world defining the need. It really gets back. So it gets back to those practices that all of us have studied now over the years of design thinking, of lean startup approaches, et cetera. But I mean, the particular I guess special sauce, if you want to call it, is empathy. Because I mean, just trying to understand, put yourself in the shoes of whether it be a physician or a patient or somebody that's gone through. We heard a talk earlier here on somebody that themselves, went through the system but has a lot of experience, themselves designing devices. It's a very different kind of situation. You actually start to pick up on needs, right? And so the way that we do that, and I think it's not everybody that does this equally well. There are people who have a pair of eyes that I don't have in particular, like that see things that I don't see. And those are the kinds of people we try and put in these kinds of roles where they're observing procedures. Ethnography is a huge part of this, but it can't be the only thing, really a deep understanding of physiology, disease state, the secondary literature in a particular area has to be there too, because otherwise what you end up with is just incremental improvements, upon what's already out there. So I think, and the other thing I can say is just really marrying and bringing together a physician and a set of engineers that is also very much a special sauce. In doing this, that's one of the reasons why we love working with a Mayo Clinic or with the University of Minnesota on projects, because that is it's a requirement. We can't really do this work without bringing that together. So these are some of the things. Just on the need, the other thing I'll say is that it's incredibly important to me to really prioritize needs based on multiple criteria. And really the three questions I think about, are really about, will it work and can you prove it? And is there a business case around this and value to the healthcare system? And if you can bring those three questions together and put a team around those, then you've got something. The needs need to be looked at in that light. And so we spend a lot of time, really debating what is truly the most compelling need once you've done this sort of upfront work.
Yeah, and so, while we're talking about identifying that unmet clinical need, Boston Scientific, obviously, it's a global company. How do you use the global scale of Boston Scientific to wrap your heads around the needs of patients in varying regions? Because, of course, it's not consistent from place to place. So talk a little bit about how you go about that process.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been increasing over the time. So I've been with the company now almost exactly 20 years. And I've seen the company evolve over that time. I think we started as a more squarely U.S.-based organization, but really over the last 10 years, increasing our global presence. And so from a commercial perspective, we have presence in many locations, but from a new product development perspective, we've been growing our global team very steadily, and we now have presence in Costa Rica and in India and a couple of locations there, as well as in China and Shanghai, Ireland. I mean, I'm going to miss some places, but the fact that we have development there and manufacturing, importantly in some of these regions as well, is really crucial for being able to do what you're essentially looking at, which is global R&D. So a couple of examples, we built our first R&D center in India near New Delhi in Gurgaon and built our teams there. And so, one of the things we said was we really want these teams not to be just doing pieces of projects. Like we wanted them to own, these. So we really asked them to understand. In particular, we were looking at urology as one of those spaces, and so understanding kidney stone management. And we developed a product that we launched last year, basically a percutaneous needle for kidney stone for PCNL, and it was developed in India, but it was a global project. It was really in collaboration with the U.S. Commercial team. All of the technology was done in India, but it leveraged our entire technical community, to bring it to bear. The test methods were done there. Again, as you said, these kinds of interventions are not done the same way around the world. So we had prior to even starting the project, we had a global ethnography project that really went around in multiple places around the world, observing procedures in the labs. And then eventually this launched. And by the way, it's not, like a one-off project. There's a portfolio behind it that's coming. So it actually keeps the engagement, because it can be hard to sometimes keep the talent, both, so it can be hard to retain the talent, and it can be hard to keep them engaged as well. And this has really been a way for us to be able to do that. And there's many other examples. Another one, which is a little bit different, but is a way that we've been able to address local needs, is in Africa. So looking at esophageal cancer in Africa, which is a particular problem there, right? Obviously it's a global problem, but it's more of a problem there. And they haven't had the access to esophageal stents. So we worked with the African Esophageal Cancer Consortium and the American Cancer Society, and really to work through a way to be able to get subsidized product to them, so it'd be more available to what is essentially an underserved population and a local need in Africa. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a lot of young startups potentially in the crowd. Can you talk a little bit about some advice you might have for them when it comes to engaging with strategics like Boston Scientific? How do they get your attention?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're open. Call, email, text, whatever it takes. We're there, and I personally I try and be as very responsive to startups. Because I understand that the needs are acute, and they usually are not, they're not looking for a response 2 weeks from now. Like, they don't have that kind of time, right? So but that being said, there's a few things that come to mind. First of all, understanding, if you're looking to engage with the Boston Scientific, understanding a little bit about what phase, depending on what you're asking for and what you want. If you're coming in and you're looking for example, an investment, and you just have an idea, this is an exaggeration, but essentially something drawn on a piece of paper or a prototype is not necessarily the right time to engage in terms of an investment, but it might be a good time to engage in talking about one of these accelerators, or so just kind of understand the stage that you're at and what you're looking for. The other thing is just understand that we have over 30,000 employees in the company. It's a big company. There are obviously bigger ones out there, and there is bureaucracy. There's a lot of stakeholders. Sometimes it can take time to find the right people, but they're there, and so being persistent, having the grit, to basically not just expect that your very first touch point is going to be the answer, right? I think even at a company like ours, it takes a couple of phone calls. So,
I want to make sure we have some time for questions. Does anyone have a question for Dave while we've got him here? We've got one from Frank. Could you run this mic back to him?
Hey, Frank.
Hey, thank you. You'd mentioned earlier a bit about the digital health work that Boston Scientific's been doing. I'm curious, is that changing the sort of talent or approaches that you need to bring into the corporate research function to accommodate services or things that maybe aren't metal or plastic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So it's not only about bringing in new talent, right? It's also about people who have been doing the metal and plastic over time or chemistry, et cetera, and then transforming those people into the people that are really experts in digital. And believe it or not, that actually happens more often than you would think, because ultimately it's the clinical experience and knowledge that we have that is incredibly valuable and unique, as opposed to being able to code. So I don't want to diminish the ideas around that, but there's also a big talent component to what you're talking about. I'll break it down into two. One is DevOps. So people who really understand, how to do that. There's sort of the people who are doing the paired programming, and it's all the agile techniques within those. Yes, we've had to search, for those folks and bring those in. They reside currently more within our IT organization, but we have in both R&D and IT. Another aspect of that is I'll mention is just once you have the data, sort of the data analytics and the AI part of that. Again, a very highly sought after skill set these days, and tough to get talent and retain talent in. But we've been successful because usually people are loving the idea of working on clinically relevant problems, right? That matter to them. And the third thing I'll just mention, I think it's been talked about a number of ways here, is cybersecurity. Hugely important. As you get into digital health, it gets even more important and increases in importance. Something that's already cuts across our entire ecosystem, and we have resources in both R&D as well as in IT, and in the divisions that really address that. So 3 factors, I guess.
Boston's been fairly acquisitive in the last couple of years. Is there anything you can say publicly in terms of what you're looking for going forward in terms of potential companies that you might want to acquire, just areas that you can say publicly?
I would look at, so I would look at, first of all, the areas that we're in, right? I mean, so our strategy really is about category leadership in the areas that we're in. So those 6 divisions I talked about, basically the cardiology divisions and the med surge divisions. So that includes the endoscopy, urology, neuromodulation. So starting there and understanding kind of that we want to basically win in those spaces is where I would start. So that is we're always looking for innovation, whether it be external or internal innovation in those spaces. The other thing I'll just mention is, and it's one that kind of cuts across multiple, so it may not be the most obvious, is we do have, and it's very obvious now, but it wasn't so much before, was we do have a big interest in cancer, and with this recent acquisition of BTG, we really have increased our interventional oncology presence, both here in Minnesota as well as in multiple other places. So cancer really cuts across multiple divisions of the company and is an area we have made acquisitions and will continue to. So those are just a couple of I guess a couple of ideas that I have, but I'm sorry I can't say specifically within those.
Other questions?
Thanks, David. Thanks for the talk. Just a quick question: as as a corporate research, how do you avoid duplication of R&D across those divisions? How do you, considering the scale, how do you keep tabs on what's happening in every one of these divisions so you're not doing the same thing? And my follow-on question is: once you pass on a technology to one of the division and they iterate on it, how do you make sure the corporate research group stays on top of any iterations and is informed of the changes made to the technology?
those are very thoughtful and questions that are based obviously with experience behind them. So let me see if I can tackle the first one. What I would say is that it's impossible for us to ensure there is not duplication across the company. It just is not, it's not possible, and it doesn't happen that way because, you know, even if we have technologies that are very similar, you know, in two divisions that happen to be actually sitting in the same building, which does happen, you know, so they're right next to one another. There are reasons for that, actually. And yes, there may be increased efficiency if we were to dictate that they use similar technology, and that may happen down the road. But speed to market and, you know, addressing patients' needs in a very specific way, you trump that, at least initially. So I would say we don't really act as police, you know, from that perspective. But what we do try and do is we try and increase the awareness across the technical community. And so that's a shared responsibility. And Randy, who is here, actually leads a council of all of our R&D executives across the company, and I'm heavily involved in it as well, where we are sharing all the time, and we have other mechanisms by which we share across the technical community. And that's one way that we essentially increase efficiency, as well as the potential to leverage platforms that already exist across the company. The second question was about making sure that the division doesn't, that they don't change or don't, you know, somehow inadvertently mess up something that corporate research has done. I'm not worried about that. I mean, the development organizations and the divisions are deep, you know, very, very skilled. And if something changes, I'm okay with that. It's going to be for the benefit of our customers. So it hasn't been a problem. I've been on both sides of it, and I've had people, you know, tell me, whether it be from corporate or from a startup or whatever, you know, don't screw this up. But you know, I take that with a grain of salt.
Time for one more. All right. How about a round of applause for David?
Thank you.